Throughout Magic's history, Wizard has printed a lot of cards, and plenty of those cards have had strange sounding effects. This is done on purpose to a degree. Wizards wants people to look at their cards and remember them, so coming up with ridiculous sounding lines of text helps players get excited for the next set. And today we're going to be looking at some of the craziest sounding lines of text Wizards has ever put on Magic cards. Starting us off at number 10, we have 100-Handed 1. This is a 3/5 giant with a mana cost of 2 and 2 white. It has Vigilance, meaning it attacking doesn't cause it to tap, and it has Monstrosity 3 for 3 and 3 white. This means you can pay the cost, and if it isn't monstrous, you can put that many +1/+1 counters on it and it becomes monstrous. And as long as 100-Handed 1 is monstrous, it has reach, allowing it to block flying creatures, and it can also block an additional 99 creatures. That last bit is what gets it on this list. Blocking additional creatures is a rare effect, with only a handful of other cards in Magic's long history even having the effect. However, no other card can block this many creatures at once. In fact, the card might as well just say it can block any number of creatures, given that getting 101 creatures is basically impossible. This card is from Theros, a set based on Greek mythology. And if you know Greek mythology, you'll remember the 100-Handed Ones as a group of 3 giants who helped Zeus overthrow the Titans. Since most of this set is allegories to these Greek myths, it's not surprising they throw a reference to them in the set. The ability to block 100 creatures is a pretty easy way to convey just how powerful and overwhelming these giants are. However, despite this very flavorful mechanic, the card didn't really see any success. The main issue was this card just wasn't that good at protecting you. It cost way too much mana to set up, and your opponent could always just use a removal spell to get rid of it and attack for a lot of damage. So simple board-wise proved to be a far better way of keeping yourself alive. So despite the card's very strong sounding effect, it ended up not really accomplishing much. And at number 9, we have Serra Avenger. This is a 3/3 angel with a mana cost of 2 white. It has flying, meaning it can't be blocked by creatures without flying or reach, and it has vigilance. However, it also has the very unique effect that you can't cast Serra Avenger on your first, second, or third turn of the game. This is a downside that hasn't appeared on any other cards, and it has some interesting effects on how the card plays. One of the biggest upsides of a card being so cheap is specifically that you can play it so early in the game. No one wants to spend their first couple of turns just playing lands and passing while your opponent develops their board. However, Avenger does still come at a great rate, so it'll be pretty great once you do finally get to cast it. On top of that, there are a few ways to cheat Avenger out a bit earlier, namely Aether Vial. This is a 1-mana artifact that lets you choose to put a counter on it during each of your upkeeps, and you can tap it to put a creature with a mana value from your hand onto the battlefield. So if you play a Vial on turn 1, you'll be able to cheat out Avenger on turn 3. This is only a turn early, but considering that you'll still have all your mana on that turn, it's a much stronger play than it might look at first. This has led Avenger to see him play in Death and Taxes deck in Legacy, where it works as an efficient attacker that can be cheated out early with the right hands. These decks also like to use their mana on later turns with cards like Rishadan Port, so cast it on turn 4 is a much better play. The card hasn't seen too much play recently, as Legacy has gotten quite a bit more powerful. And at number 8, we have Gilt-Leaf Archdruid. This is a 3/3 elf druid with a mana cost of 3 and 2 green. It has the abilities where, whenever you cast a druid spell, you draw a card. It also has the ability where you can tap 7 untapped druids you control to gain control of all lands target player controls. This is an effect that makes a lot of players double take. Cards like Armageddon that destroy all lands are both extremely powerful and very rare in the modern day. Lands are sort of a sacred cow in the games nowadays, as losing all your lands means you just can't do anything. While there are cards in the game that severely restrict both players' access to their lands, there are very few one-sided land destruction effects. In order to get this kind of effect, players usually need to do something like cast a card like Heroic Intervention, and then cast an Armageddon effect. That way all their own lands will be protected from the card's effect. Getting this effect on a single card is very unique. Not to mention the fact that you're also getting to take control of all those lands, putting you extremely far ahead on mana. Now, while this is a very strong effect, actually pulling it off is a bit unlikely. This is a 5-mana creature with only 3 toughness, making it very easy to remove. On top of that, getting 7 creatures is very difficult, not to mention getting 7 cards of a specific creature type. If you wanted to try and pull this off, using a card like Maskwood Nexus to turn all your random tokens into druids is probably the way to go. However, this runs into the problem of kind of being a win more strategy, as if you can get 7 druids on the field, you might as well just attack for lethal instead of trying to use this card to blow out your opponent. Still, Archdruid is a pretty fun card that I'm surprised I haven't seen pop up more on Commander tables. And at number 7, we have Apex Devastator. This is a 10/10 Chimera Hydra with a mana cost of 8 and 2 green. It has Cascade, meaning whenever you cast a spell, you exile cards to the top of your deck into exile a non-land card that costs less. You cast that card for free. Then you throw the rest on the bottom of your deck in a random order. It also has Cascade, Cascade, and surprisingly enough, Cascade. Jokes aside, seeing the same keyword on a card 4 times in a row is extremely rare. You see, most keywords don't stack. Multiple instances of flying, for example, are completely redundant. However, if a card has multiple instances of Cascade, each will trigger separately. Before Apex Devastator, we had Maelstrom Wanderer, which had 2 instances of Cascade. This made it a pretty popular card in casual formats like Commander, but Apex Devastator really puts it to shame by doubling the number of Cascades you get. However, we can go even further. Abaddon the Despoiler makes any spell you cast on your turn with a mana value of X or less have Cascade, where X is how much life your opponent has lost this turn. Maelstrom Nexus gives the first turn you cast each spell Cascade. Sloppity Bilepiper lets you pay some mana and sacrifice a creature to give the next creature you cast this turn Cascade. Yudra's Maelstrom Wielder makes it so that, if it deals combat damage to a player, spells you cast from your hand this turn will gain Cascade. Reign of Riches gives any spell you cast using mana from a treasure token Cascade. Finally, the first silver will give any silver spells Cascade. Devastator isn't a silver, of course, but that's where Maskwood Nexus comes in. So, with all 6 of these effects active, we can cast Devastator to get 10 Cascade triggers. This is pretty crazy, as well as entirely impractical. Still, it would be a fun way to win a game of Commander, and maybe someday we'll be able to get a card that can allow us to Cascade 11 times off of 1 Devastator. And at number 6, we have Karn Liberated. This is a Planeswalker with a starting loyalty of 6 and a mana cost of 7. You can +4 to have target player exile a card from their hand. You can -3 him to exile target permanent, and you can -14 him to restart the game with each non-aura permanent exiled by Karn Liberated on the battlefield under your control. Karn gets on this list for his crazy -14 ability, which is the only card in the game that can restart the game. Now, Karn is a very strong card overall. Thanks to lands like the Urza lands and Cloudposts, lands that let you make a ton of colorless mana fast, letting you slam threats like Karn into play extremely early. Now, while this card is extremely good, the -14 ability basically never gets used. By the time you're in a position to activate Karn's ultimate ability, the game is already essentially over. Your opponent will usually just scoop to you whenever you activate the ability. In practice, Karn is basically a very strong, repeatable removal spell, coming down and exiling multiple cards from your opponent's board and hand. While its ultimate is underutilized, it's still one of the most unique effects in the game. And at number 5, we have Goblin Game. This is a sorcery with the mana cost of 5 and 2 red. It has the effect where each player hides at least 1 item, and then they reveal the items they hid. Each player loses life equal to the number of items they revealed, then each player who revealed the fewest number of items loses half their life, rounded up. The weird part of this card is fairly obvious. Asking players to physically hide objects is a very strange thing to do. The weirdest thing is that we've seen tons of cards that do a similar thing without this weird step. For example, Wheel of Misfortune has a similar effect where players have to bet amounts of life for the powerful effect of getting to discard their hand and draw 7 cards. However, even in its Oracle text, the updated card text for every card that Wizards maintains, Goblin Game does specifically ask you to hide objects. It doesn't ask you to choose a number like Misfortune does, they do expect you to hide some coins or dice or something. On that note, I want to quickly mention an absolutely perfect ruling on the card, where someone from Wizards or an MtG judge said, "When it comes to the choice of items, use common sense." On the note of the actual use of the card, Goblin Game is pretty terrible. 7 mana is a crazy amount to pay for something, and only affecting your opponent's life total makes it very unattractive. It won't ever even kill your opponent unless they're at exactly 1 or 2 life, as they can always just only wager 1 life and only have to lose half their life total. So it's not a surprise that the card not only hasn't seen competitive success, but also hasn't seen any play, even in casual circles outside of joke decks. And at number 4, we have Spellweaver Volute. This is an Aura enchant with a mana cost of 3 and 2 blue. It has Enchant Instant card and a graveyard. It also has the ability where, whenever you cast a sorcery spell, you can copy the enchanted instant and cast a copy of it, without paying its mana cost. Then you exile the instant card from your graveyard, and attach it to a different instant card in your graveyard. This is the very first, and to this day, only aura that enchants a card not on the battlefield. This card comes to us from Future Sight, a set based around giving players a glimpse into the possible future of Magic, and is to this day a source of some of the weirdest cards in the game. This is also the set that gave us enchantments that tap, something that the game has basically never done before, or since. Back to Volute, the card's ability to let you recast instants is potentially powerful, but a bit too slow. It required you to cast a sorcery to get them back makes it a bit volatile, as it does require you to play a lot of instants to really get the value out of the card. So you have to split your deck between multiple card types to try and get it to work. Volute being an aura does have some upsides, for example, allowing you to search it off of Open the Armory. Though, since the card wants you to play so many sorceries and instants, it can actually be quite difficult to put in a deck with these kinds of tutors. Combining this with how easy the card is to remove, as getting rid of the single instant in the graveyard would cause the card to fall off, and you end up with a card that's mostly bulk. And at number 3, we have Rootpath Purifier. This is a 3/4 elf druid with a mana cost of 3 and 1 green. It is the ability where all lands you control and all lands in your library are basic. Now, this is something people have been speculating on for years, but actually seeing it on a real card is still kind of shocking. For anyone who's not quite sure how this works, The basic is a super type that basically just denotes certain lands from their non-basic, restricted to 4 copies per deck lands. This doesn't come into play while building your deck, of course, as Purifier's ability isn't active unless it's already on the battlefield. However, there are plenty of cards that care about cards being basic or not. For instance, cards like Rampant Growth specifically allow you to search basic lands out of your deck and put them directly into the battlefield. This lets you tutor out powerful lands like Valakut the Molten Pinnacle with way more cards than you could before. It also makes your lands a lot more resilient. There's a ton of non-basic land hate, like Wasteland and Blood Moon, and with a Purifier in the battlefield, all of your lands will be immune to these cards' effects. Now, Purifier isn't a competitively successful card, but it does seem to be a pretty popular card in Commander, holding onto a pretty respectable price tag. And at number 2, we have City in a Bottle. This is an artifact with a mana value of 2. It has the ability where, whenever one or more non-token permanents with the name originally printed in Arabian Nights expansions are on the battlefield, its controller sacrifices them. And additionally, players can't cast spells or play lands of cards first printed in Arabian Nights. Now, before we get too deep, we do also need to mention Apocalypse Chime, an artifact that costs 2 and has the ability where you can pay 2, tap, and sacrifice it to make each player sacrifice all their cards from homelands. These are the only 2 cards that reference what a set a card is from, for fairly obvious reasons. First off, knowing what set a card was originally printed in is not necessarily the easiest thing to track down. It's usually only a Google search away, but players aren't really expected to be able to have internet access when they're playing a game of Magic. In a tournament setting, they often aren't even allowed to look at sources on the internet. So this is obviously not good for practical purposes. However, from a game design perspective, it's also just not a great mechanic. No one wants to be locked out of playing cards because they happen to be printed in the wrong set. Lock pieces do exist in Magic, but they're at least based on what type of strategy you're trying to employ. City in a Bottle just seems kind of random in the effect it has on a game. Now, luckily, no one's really had to deal with this card. Not because the cards are banned, they're entirely legal in fact, but because the 2 sets they shut down, Arabian Nights and Homelands, are kind of famously terrible sets. Outside of Bazaar Baghdad from Arabian Nights, I can't think of any cards from these sets that are particularly powerful or notable. So at the end of the day, the cards are more of a novelty of the time when Magic was still figuring things out more than anything. And at number 1, we have Word of Command. This is an instant with a mana cost of 2 black. It has the effect where you look at target opponent's hand and choose a card from it. You control the player until Word of Command finishes resolving. The player plays that card if able. While doing so, the player can activate mana abilities only if they're from lands that player controls, and only if mana they produce is spent to activate other mana abilities of lands the player controls and or to play that card. If the chosen card is cast as a spell, you control the player while the spell is resolving. This is a very old card, first being printed all the way back in Alpha, the first set of Magic. The reason this card makes this list has to do a lot with just how hard to follow the card's effect is. The thing is, it doesn't need to be this way. Cards like Covetous Urge do basically the same thing and are a lot easier to follow. However, it does do a few things that other cards don't, namely allowing you to use your opponent's lands to cast the spell. This is an effect that very few cards have. However, it does lead to some weirdness with the card. Since your opponent is still the one casting the spell, if your opponent can cast something to use up their mana, they can stop you from getting to use whatever card you were trying to steal. Even then, you have to use cards like a Lightning Bolt that can target their controller or cards they control, as otherwise you'd just be casting one of their own spells for them. Due to all of these massive drawbacks, Word of Command has basically never seen any play. Its only real claim to fame is every line of the text in the card being a complete head scratcher. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any cards you think we may have missed with crazy lines of card text, or have any future ideas for videos just like this one? If so, please let us know down in the comments below.